Hello, everybody, and welcome to Commodity Culture, where our goal is to make you a better investor in the commodities sector. My name is Jesse Day. Before we dive in, standard disclaimer, nothing here is investment advice. Do your own due diligence. And today's guest is the CEO of TRX Gold, a company rapidly advancing the low-risk, high-margin Buckreef gold project in Tanzania. It's Stephen Mullowney. Great to have you on the show.
It's great to be here, and I look forward to the podcast and you grilling me on a few questions and my views.
Awesome. I cannot wait as well. I want to start by taking a step back and looking at the gold market from a broader perspective by asking what are the main themes and trends that you're currently watching when it comes to the gold market that you think investors should be paying attention to right now?
Yeah, so the gold market, I think there's a couple of themes that are out there. One is obviously we've seen interest rates decline, and so know with the Trump presidency, which way your interest rate's going to go. That will always be something that is a focus because traditionally, and I say traditionally, interest rates have been gold has been an inverse relationship to interest rates, and so in that regard too is gold has had a good run based on inflation as well. So keeping an eye on inflation and where is inflation going, money supply, all those traditional metrics. It's also the geopolitical risk in the world seems to be increasing. Despite the U.S. election, I think that that's going to continue. There are going to still be anti-American forces out there in the world, and there's still going to be disputes in the world. And I think that is something to keep an eye on. The world is becoming a little bit rougher of a playground, and then with regards to that and U.S. sanctions, I think you need to keep an eye on that too, and the buildup of other currencies and those sort of things. So, or the potential to try to replace U.S. dollar. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, but certainly there's always rumblings of that, and central banks putting gold in their portfolios. So those are the broader themes, and gold has reacted well to those.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely a lot more geopolitical uncertainty these days. And gold has put in a fantastic performance year to date, up around 28%. It's outperformed the S&P 500 and the Dow Jones. You would think that media headlines would be everywhere about this level of outperformance from an asset that gets very little, if any, allocation from traditional financial managers. Why the silence in the mainstream press at this point in time, and what will it take for people to start paying more attention to gold?
I think that's a good question, and I think one of the reasons for there's a little bit more of a silence on gold has been the performance of Bitcoin and the attention that Bitcoin has got, particularly after the U.S. election and the run up in Bitcoin over 100,000. So that's been significant, and it's taken a lot of headlines. Also, I do believe that gold is what we call a little bit of a historical or older sort of asset class, and thus with its maturity is it doesn't have the same volatility as newer asset classes, and that's what I compared to the crypto. There's forward markets, there's paper contracts, all of that sort of exists in gold. But that being said, I do see pictures of a bar of gold could buy a house 50 years ago, and a bar of gold can buy a house today. And so it has protected inflation fairly well, and that's really the goal. What gold is invested in is a protection of inflation, and it has done very well that way. I expect that gold, as the world becomes, as we just mentioned, more and more geopolitical risk, will get more and more headlines. I also like one thing that I don't see a lot of press on is continued government deficits, and gold usually reacts fairly well in that. But we haven't seen a lot of headlines on deficits. What we see in the United States, for instance, and same here in Canada, is what we'll call is the left spends deficits and the right tax cuts to deficits. But there's deficits. We haven't seen a lot of
very good summary there.
Yeah, we haven't seen a lot of headlines on that.
Very true. I want to touch on some well-established investors that have entered the gold space. We saw Stanley Druckenmiller and Paul Tudor Jones allocate capital to gold. I want to read a quote from Tudor Jones. He said, "I'm long gold. I think commodities are so ridiculously under-owned, so I'm long commodities." What are your thoughts there? Obviously, these are gentlemen with a very long and successful track record in investing. Warren Buffett infamously, I think, called gold a doorstop. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't yield anything, so he's not interested. But do you think we'll start to see more of this big money in the form of other big name investors or institutions start to allocate more capital to the gold space as we move forward into 2025?
Yeah, I do. Look, and prior to me coming in this role 4 years ago, when I was at PwC, I advised a lot of asset managers as well as large pension funds on commodity exposure. So a lot of pension funds and a lot of investors were underweight commodities. And historically, they want to try to be around 2% of their portfolios, and they were well and under net. And that's excluding oil and gas, because North American pensions and funds are oil and gas is well represented in their portfolios. But the commodities and gold, copper, and other commodities were traditionally underrepresented. And to your point around Warren Buffett, they wanted to try to get exposure to the growth in the asset and the value of the asset and inflation protection. But they also wanted to try to come up with structures that got them leverage to the asset and protection on the downside as well. So I fully expect that trend to continue, particularly if we see the same trends going on in the world. Like I said, 30 years ago, I bought a house. Today, it buys a house for the same number of ounces. So it has held up as an inflation hedge, and certainly asset managers look at it that way.
What do you think about the central bank gold buying aspect of the market? There's a lot of theories on this. Some say since the US froze Russia's FX reserves, countries got put on notice. Well, they could sanction us next. You never know who's going to be political allies or enemies, especially considering all this geopolitical risk we talked about. On the other, well, maybe not on the other end, but on perhaps the more conspiratorial end of the spectrum, there are some who say that, well, the central banks know that there's a monetary reset coming and gold is going to become a part of the international monetary system. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on central bank gold accumulation.
Yeah, so when you look at history, I guess I'm going to answer this question a little bit differently than I answered it before, because of the way you phrased the question. When you look at history, the Bretton Woods system, really, it was less than 50 years ago. That's not long in the history when you think about a timeline of history, right? So, it's certainly longer than my age, but it is really, in time, it's not that long ago. So with all the uncertainty and with the BRICS out there saying they want to try to have a different form of exchange besides the US dollar or King dollar, then yeah, I'm not surprised that you have central bank gold buying. That has historically been what central banks invest in. There are cycles of central banks buying and disposing of that. We're into the buying cycle. With all the uncertainty and geopolitical risk, gold is not traceable, right? The bars. So it can be smelted, it can be moved. You don't need an electronic transaction around it. All of those factors go into central banks wanting to put it in place. And there's been, articles that I've read that gold is being traded in the East. And certainly we get approached all the time from people in the East wanting to buy gold, and being used to try to avoid U.S. sanctions. So that's out there. If you wanted to go into conspiracy theory, I can see how that can work, and why. And so, all of those factors, I'm sure, has led to demand. We see a demand of gold moving from west to east as well. I do see that, and I've read lots of articles on that.
Yeah, that's a very good point about the untraceability of gold. I hadn't heard that argument when it comes to central bank accumulation, but it does make total sense, and it's one thing that separates gold from crypto.
Yes.
I want to discuss I want to discuss how TRX Gold fits into the picture. Could you start by giving us an overview of the company?
So an overview of the company, we're in Tanzania. We operate the Buckreef Gold Project, which has over 2 million ounces in measured and indicated category, an open pit mine. The average grade of the deposit's 1.8 grams a ton in measured and indicated category. So very good deposit, comes to surface, is straightforward open pit mining, straightforward metallurgy. And the business plan that we put in place is to grow it slowly under production capacity, utilizing the cash flow to put back into increases in production as well as exploration. So last year we did over 15 million of EBITDA in free cash flow, and we reinvested that right back into the business. And that was just over 20,000 ounces. So, we're under around $1,000 cash cost for the operation. So good little operation that continues to grow, that has a really, really good future on growth and more growth and more growth.
Well, I'd like to get some more details on the Buckreef project and Tanzania as a jurisdiction as well. So, could you walk us through the infrastructure you have in place, relationship with local government and community, and anything else you think it's important to touch on?
So on the project, we have a 2,000 ton per day plant. We've done that over 3 expansions that were all on time and all on budget over the last 2.5 years. And so that is operating on site. We have a contract miner on site as well as our own mining equipment as well. And we continually expand that, and we'll look to, basically make the operations much more profitable over the next year by putting in place operational improvements around that plant and mining. Now, with regards to on site, there's now over 700 people. So when I joined just over 4 years ago, there was only around 20 people. But now we have 700 people, including contractors. So there's a lot of local jobs there, and we're 100% local on site. So obviously we have a good social relationship with that growth, with that employment profile in the region that we operate. The government is extremely supportive of mining investment. We're in front of the government now on how do we come up with a new framework agreement or an investable agreement around the Buckreef Gold project in order to continually expand it and meet the objectives of the country. And help them meet their objectives, which is more foreign currency, 10% of GDP they want from the minerals sector, and they want to support that growth in the mining sector and the jobs that come with it. Obviously, with gold and other commodities, there's a lot of royalties and taxes that get paid as well, and no matter what jurisdiction you're in, and that helps support the social infrastructure of the country and the government expenditure. So all in all, really good reception. The infrastructure is good in Tanzania, both human capital. There's major mines there, like Barrick's mines, has some mines there. AngloGold Ashanti's largest mines there. So we have no trouble attracting good talent. We are only 10 to 15 kilometers at the end on paved. We're on the national power grid, which is going to go almost predominantly hydro with the Julius Nyerere facility coming online and ramping up. So all in all, the infrastructure is really good, and we've built things really quickly and really cost effectively there.
Well, TRX Gold recently reported year-end 2024 results. Could you walk us through those results, the impact they're having on the company now and moving forward?
Yeah, so the results, as I mentioned previously, we had just did over 20,000 ounces in the last 2 years, around a cash cost of around $1,000 an ounce. And we've taken the cash flow from operations and reinvested it in the business. So that helped do the plant expansion, as well as develop the pit. In the next year, we expect to do more ounces than we did last year. We expect to reinvest that into further operational improvements, and also we have to get to the drill bit because there's so much gold on this property that we need to explore. We're finding new trends every day, and we really got to drill those out to get them into the resource and reserve categories, to put them into the mine plan, to increase other valuation metrics of the property, such as net asset value, and show the market of the potential for it to increase production significantly. It can increase production significantly on the current resource base, but it would be easier to on a much larger resource base, and the mine life would go on a lot longer.
Well, you have a focus on prudent capital management that minimizes shareholder dilution. You mentioned reinvestment into the company's operations there. Could you talk to us about your overall strategy, your philosophy behind raising and allocating capital moving forward as well for the company?
Yeah, so with regards to capital, is when I came in, the company needed to, re-solidify its balance sheet. So we haven't done a capital raise in over 3 years now. And the net capital was raised, I believe, I got the numbers in front of me, was around $23.5 million. we've now invested over 2 times that amount into the asset because we utilize cash flow from operations into the asset. So that's a good story. So the asset continues to grow its EBITDA. We get on a good return on capital investment. Going forward, look, we need to see good returns on the capital that we reinvest into the asset. So I'm not talking single-digit IRRs. It has to be significant IRR and short payback periods to make that investment. If we were to go to the market or ask shareholders for additional capital, there had to be a really, really good use for it that would spring shareholder value, both existing and future shareholders. So that may be accelerating drill programs, for instance, given what we're seeing on the property, or an acceleration of plant expansions bringing more capital. Again, it has to have the potential to have a very, very, very high return.
And what are some upcoming catalysts and news flow that investors can expect coming out of TRX Gold and the Buckreef project?
We turn to be a little bit boring because we're taking cash from operations and reinvesting it. So that's a good thing. But that doesn't mean there's not excitement around it. So one is obviously operational improvements around the plant and potential expansions again around that. A better, what I would say, putting forward a much better business plan around what we're going to do around exploration and those plant expansions, and then exploration and what's on this property. So we've had our best drill hole results released in the last month. We got more drill holes into that Stanford Bridge trend and zone. I'm smiling, so I have an idea what they're showing. They're not obviously complete yet. And so it's the expansionary aspect of both production and the exploration. I think there's a lot more gold here than anybody will anticipate, but it needs to be drilled out.
I want to circle back to the jurisdiction one more time because Africa. So people look at situations like the coup in Niger, which happened recently, and Western investors tend to lump the entire continent together when it comes to that sort of risk that they perceive. So I'm wondering if you could maybe dive a little bit more into your relationship with the local government, what you're seeing when you're there on the ground, and why Tanzania is differentiated from a jurisdiction like what happened in Niger.
Yeah, so look, in Tanzania, you have some good M&A happening. Perseus just took out OreCorp in the last 6 to 9 months, and that's a property 20, 30 kilometers away from us. So that you also have BHP in there in the Kabanga Nickel project. So you're getting some really good Western investment into Tanzania. They want that Western investment to grow the profile of the mining industry in the country. They've made that clear. They're entering into framework agreements with a lot of miners and are very supportive of that. So that's different than the other African countries. It also is a parliamentary system that's more of a one-party parliamentary system. So that provides a little bit more stability versus what you've seen in what I'll call Niger and Mali and Burkina Faso. So, that's a different aspect. I would also say the Russian influence in Tanzania is minimal versus the countries that you just mentioned in Niger, and I mentioned Mali and Burkina Faso. So that's a significant difference. And our relationship's good with the government. As long as we've grown the asset, there's 700 jobs there now, and they're constantly asking us, how do we continue to grow it? How do we make it more of a economic impact in Tanzania? So, look, these are risks that you need to manage. You need to sit down and talk to people. Is it always straightforward? No. Is it always smooth? No. But it isn't in North America either. So you just have different factors at play. We deal with government a lot more. North America, you deal with government on environmental permits a lot more. Or in Canada, you deal with native communities. You just have different risk profiles. And you got to, as a company executive, you got to know what those risk profiles are and manage them. I've done this before in my prior roles, so I'm quite comfortable with the risk profile of the country. And I don't need to go around with a security detail in Tanzania. In other countries, I would. So I like to be operating in jurisdictions where I feel safe.
Yeah, and that's a great point regarding North America as well. It has its own jurisdictional risk in terms of permitting times, and governmental red tape as well. So that's a great analogy there. I want to end by opening the floor to you. Is there anything we haven't yet discussed, or perhaps something you want to emphasize that you think it's important for potential shareholders to know about TRX Gold?
I would say the most important thing to know is we want to invest capital in high returns, and we want to continually grow the asset and grow the company. So growing the company's resource base, its production profile, and we'll probably diversify at some point in time as well. We have built up a great skill set over the last 3 to 4 years, and we should be utilizing that elsewhere to grow shareholder value.
Great. Well, I'll put a link in the description below to the TRX Gold website as well as social media profile for people who want to follow the company. Thank you so much, Stephen, once again for coming on and sharing your knowledge with the audience.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jesse, and thank you for the questions.
Commodity Culture is a series on commodities and natural resources. If you would like to see more, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification so you're always up to date with the latest episodes.